Welcome to BA1002, Week 7, Reality and Virtuality. Let's get started. Today's lecture structure is going to follow the lecture structure that we generally follow in this class, beginning with complexifying our everyday ideas about reality and virtuality. And then we're going to move into some histories of ideas about reality and virtuality. And in part 3, alongside thinking about contemporary theorists of virtuality and reality, we're going to be thinking about why this matters for networks. So let's begin with a thought problem, and it's just a statement that has been made by the philosopher and social theorist Jean Baudrillard, and is reiterated as well by Rob Shields in his important work called The Virtual. Both of them make the statement that much of what we already call reality is virtual, or that is, much of what we call reality is already virtual. So if that has already done your mind in, then you might want to pause and quickly in a notebook kind of write what you think your interpretation of that statement is. Why is what we call reality around us, which one would think one could touch and measure and test, virtual? And try to come up with your little answer to that problematic statement, or turn it into a question. Why is reality, or why would any philosopher say reality is already virtual? And just try to answer that as best as you can before we begin, and then we'll dive in. So part 1, complexifying reality and virtuality. In last week's lecture, when we thought about narrative and communication, we learned that media technologies are one way that we shape a social reality around us. Okay, so one way in which we realized that language structures reality is the way in which language comes to us through various forms of media or technologies of inscription. So your blog reading last week went from the ideas of Ong to the ideas of Eisenstein, and noted a few major transitions that we've seen in the last 2,000 years as a society in the way that we transform information. Beginning with Walter Ong, who theorized society in an oral stage before most people could read and write. And he began to think about how we shaped the information in the world around us because we were largely oral. He said if people were learned in that day, such as the poet Homer, who wrote epic poems and recited them, they often needed to remember them. They needed to memorize them because there wasn't access to paper and pens, and these were performed in public. And so many of the old epics that are very, very long used a lot of mnemonic devices, memory devices, such as alliteration and rhyme, as ways to remember long poems. Ong also told us that these stories were often told in a particular setting. So for example, within a household, or within a given tribe or people group. And so there were opportunities to question and interact with the person who was giving information. And information was something that was not seen as truth out there, but was something that was produced by the community in interaction with the person who is sharing a story or sharing an epic or information. It was also very acoustically oriented, so to sound. Ear was the main instrument through which we receive this kind of information. And Ong thought about how this completely changed when people became reoriented to print culture through the book, when authority was no longer communally decided, but was vested in words, in letters, for example, or in pictures, which were also reproduced. He also said instead of the community questioning the person who was talking or producing meaning through interactive dialogue, there tended to be one single educated interpreter. Because illiteracy was still widespread, this person was conferred a lot of power, thought of as incredibly wise. When more and more people could read, they could engage with the text themselves, and that led to an idea of singularity or individuality, a lone reader engaging in an unbroken way with information at his fingertips through the text of the book that he has in front of him. And gradually, he said, this gave us this idea that there is a fixed meaning and truth. Elizabeth Eisenstein theorized a slightly different shift in society, and she theorized it slightly differently, but she also thought about how the structures of technology through which we receive information shape our reality. And she was interested in how we moved from scribal culture, where there were a few people who could read and write, but who needed to dip feathers in ink pots, and who painstakingly needed to copy information, usually from the Bible, and illuminate it beautifully as an art form. She thought about how that culture, the culture of the scribes, changed when we went to the culture of movable type through the Gutenberg press that was invented in the 1400s, the mid-1400s. Though we did, of course, have printing presses before the Gutenberg press, the amazing novelty and technological innovation of the Gutenberg press was movable type. The idea that you don't need to just stamp a wood block and have the same thing being pressed again and again on each piece of paper, but rather that you can have a whole tray of different letters and rearrange it inside another tray that you can then put ink over and press and produce thousands of identical pages very quickly. And also many different pages that aren't identical also quickly in a book, no longer something that's a parchment, but something that was bound together, meant that we had a proliferation of information. So the Gutenberg press was the first information revolution. And she said this radically changed people and led to not only the idea of the Protestant Reformation that we're going to be talking about in the lecture today, but also to democracy and to the scientific revolution. This idea that we can have units broken down into smaller units that we can move around and recombine is, in essence, Eisenstein said, a scientific way of thinking. Both of these theorists concur with, or Marshall McLuhan concurs with them, that essentially the medium is the message. The technology through which we think we're simply transmitting information actually shapes the way we experience information. It shapes our engagement with the universe. And in this way, because it's already mediated by technology, we could say that any form of technological mediation causes us to have a sense of a virtual reality. It's no longer unfiltered by technology, but it is processed through technology and as such changed by it. Perhaps you think I'm stretching the definition of the virtual here. But let's continue to reinforce what we talked about last week, which is the ways in which representation has a huge effect, not just on how individuals think of their being in the world, but on political changes and of course, symbolic effects too. So we talked about the structural transformation in the public sphere last week, and how Habermas was drawing from Karl Marx's idea of the organic community that was changed in the transition from feudalism to modern capitalism, or from early empire when people were largely still living where their forebears had been born and raised, and the people before them as well, to industrialization, when people were moving into cities to take up jobs in factories. Now, Marx talked about this period before people moved into cities or before people worked for money as a kind of organic community. And it wasn't idealized completely. Of course, we know patriarchy was still an issue in the organic community, and not everybody had equal access to power. But even yet, what Marx noticed was that the way that people had lived historically was very different from the transformations that were undertaken in the era of capitalism and industrialization. Now, Habermas built upon that idea with his idea of the public sphere. And he said one thing that happens when people move from their natal place, their place of birth, their village, for example, under feudalism, or their tribal affiliation, to a more general public, is that you have different ideas, different perspectives, people from different backgrounds, classes, genders, upbringings, languages even. So they're bringing with them their different information filter. And generally, there weren't a lot of places for people to meet and congregate and discuss ideas, and he said, until the advent of the coffee shop, which was such a dangerous place that Charles II tried to have it outlawed. Because it was a place, like the early internet, where people exchanged information freely across distance, across social distance, gender difference, and class difference, and sometimes across space and place, too. They became hubs in a village network where people would gather and exchange ideas soberly, not like in the pub, and also in a place where women were admitted. And he believed that it was so important, this coffee shop, to the exchange, free exchange of ideas, because the press at that time was still incredibly limited. It was limited to people who had education, which was still incredibly small number of people who were therefore elite, but it was also limited because it was controlled by the king and by local political authorities. So people were very afraid of speaking in places of, committing perhaps themselves to paper. Those were still mostly the formal channels of political communication, top down. But in places where there was a little bit more privacy, and people could hide in relative anonymity and not be held to account for what they had said in the exchange of their ideas by the king, for example, in the coffee shop. You got what Habermas said was the public sphere. And he said it was really important to the advent of democracy and to the overthrowing of unequal distribution of wealth that was aggregated with aristocratic societies that were monarchies. So this structural transformation of the public sphere is something that he's talking about happening twofold. One is that, first of all, you have the formation of the public sphere in the coffee house of the 1600s or the 17th century. And then as more and more people can read and write toward the 1800s, especially the 1900s, when you had near universal education and near universal literacy by the 1920s in places like America and England and Europe, Canada, for example, and perhaps even Australia, we had distributions of newspapers. And he said, even though that seemed like it was even more democratic, giving us more and more access to information, you're getting the splitting of the public sphere. First of all, you're getting multiple different publics once you get things like magazines as well and different kinds of newspapers. But you also have commercial interests, and you have censorship again that's introduced later on. So he said that was a structural transformation. Another person, Benedict Anderson, who we visited last week very briefly, talked about how the national newspaper also had a really important political effect. The idea that the first national newspapers could be spread from metropolitan cities all across vast continental spaces where everybody was literally on the same page every day was really important for the formation of settler colonial nationalism, particularly in places like Australia, the USA, and Canada. The people believed they were all following the same political drama. The same political figures had the same significance in each other's lives, could not have happened without the national newspaper, according to theorist Benedict Anderson. So we can see then later on that these early commercial structures were changing public space, and that public space was also being changed by some of these technologies. And in our lecture last week, we did a large journey until we finally got up to the advent of what we see now is further structural transformations in the public sphere through the proliferation of filter bubbles and echo chambers, where people are only talking to people who have the same views as themselves. They're only reading the same news feed, depending on their particular points of view, which are then only reinforced by them. And how it's not just a commercial structure that's involved in that now, but also a further technological structure, because the algorithm has a role in selecting the filter bubble of news that you'll find yourself in. So all of these things, through a shared or perhaps divided social reality, show us that in some ways what we perceive as reality is a kind of consensual dreaming. And that consensual dreaming and the nature of it shifts depending on what kind of structures, political or technological or otherwise, are organizing that information for us. So in those ways, last week when we thought about narrative and communication, we already kind of came to the conclusion that reality is highly mediated for us the minute it is transformed by symbol systems. We don't have unmediated access to reality as an even bolder statement that Lacan makes. Now, we visited Lacan in previous lectures when we thought about his important ideas for the development of the self-concept, for example, of how we think of ourselves as individuals who have skin bags around us and borders and boundaries on our bodies, and that we have a name and that I can call myself that name and I can associate myself with that symbol of that name or my image in the mirror, and that I believe that I am the same person yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and I can project myself into the past, into the future. That requires a kind of self-talk itself. And so language was very, very important for Lacan in terms of the idea of the development of the self. And he posited that before the mirror stage in infant development, where an infant can recognize him or her or themselves in the mirror as a being with body boundaries and point at it and say be, he believed that people sort of had a very disorganized sense of their relation to their world. A disorganized sense of their relation to the world that can be restored to someone, for example, after they have a stroke, or which they may feel also on psychedelic drugs, for example. But Lacan is actually making a larger point than self-identity when he makes these pronouncements about the role of language in the shaping of selfhood and our understanding of ourselves as beings with boundaries. He's actually saying something about the nature of reality. And he believes that the nature of reality at its absolute core is that disaggregated, disorganized blur of information that an infant has a primal encounter with. But as soon as we're hailed into or interpolated into systems of language, we lose. And we become, therefore, beings of language. So Lacan says beyond that infant state, that is completely impossible to encounter. We can only talk around this as a kind of conceptual intellectual problem, but we can't really get there. And he, like so many theorists, likes to schematize things into, three different categories. So Freud did this when he came up with the id and the ego and the superego. And Lacan was building on the work of Freud, and he came up with this tripartite structure of the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. But he's French, so you have to say l'imaginaire, réel, and the symbolique, something like that. And what he says is, the imaginary is incredibly perspectival. It does tend to be pre-linguistic, and it does differ from person to person. But he believes there is perhaps some substrate even below that, kind of perhaps like Jung's collective unconscious, that not one being can encounter the entirety of. And he calls that the real. So he says there's an imaginary encounter we have through that's pre-linguistic before we talk, and it's very perspectival. And then there's also the symbolic encounter we have through that after we are language beings. And that tends to be something that's filtered through a lens of social ideas, socially or institutionally decided norms. And it differs from culture to culture, as we learned last week. So the symbolic, according to Lacan, whether it's semiotic or whether it's through images or whether it's linguistic or whether it's just the idea of language itself or whether it's the kinds of technologies that share ideas and spread ideas for us, whether it's our just oral culture or scribal culture, or printing presses, or newspapers and magazines and print culture, all of that, he says, becomes part of symbolic reality. And after we are hailed into symbolic reality, according to Lacan, our access to the imaginary is only perspectival and completely limited, and even more so, our access to anything that is pure, undifferentiated beingness is impossible to encounter. Now, that's a really hard thing to get your head around, but what he is basically saying there is that he is agreeing with Baudrillard and with Shields that what we already encounter is virtual. Our sense of our everyday shared consensual reality, he would say, is a consensual hallucination. It is already virtual. So just to complexify those ideas and make sure you're well and truly screwed up, that's where we like to start with in this subject. And I've got a 1-minute clip for you to watch. And then you can move on to part 2 of the lecture, where we're going to think about the history of ideas around the virtual and the real.